In this country, money and power decide everything, Sarah. You're just a nice round zero. That's what my ex-husband told me, smiling. 3 minutes before a judge he'd bribed was set to strip me of custody of my own son. I stood up, took off my glasses, and told him he was right about one thing. My name is Sarah Voss. I was 38 years old, and this is the story of the 6 months I spent proving my ex-husband right about exactly one thing, and catastrophically wrong about everything else. I married Dominic Reyes 9 years ago, back when Reyes Development Group was still a modest regional builder rather than the sprawling real estate empire it eventually became. I want to tell you honestly that those early years were genuinely good ones. Dominic worked relentlessly, and for a long time I believed that relentlessness came from ambition rather than something considerably hungrier underneath it. I remember our first apartment, a cramped two-bedroom above a dry cleaner that Dominic used to joke he'd replace with something considerably better within 5 years, a promise he actually kept, though I've come to understand, looking back, that the specific manner in which he kept it mattered considerably more than the promise itself. Success came steadily, then suddenly, in the way it sometimes does in real estate. One favorable rezoning decision and one well-timed acquisition compounding into a portfolio worth considerably more than either of us had imagined during those early years above the dry cleaner. Our son Noah was born 5 years into the marriage. I watched Dominic change slowly over the following years, the specific way success changes some people, convincing them gradually that whatever they've acquired entitles them to acquire considerably more, by whatever means happened to be available. I remember the exact dinner, maybe 2 years before the divorce, when he described a competitor's bankruptcy with something close to open satisfaction rather than the professional neutrality I might have expected, and understanding in that specific moment that something fundamental in him had shifted in a direction I didn't entirely recognize anymore. I want to explain something about my own career before I go any further because it matters enormously for everything that follows. I've worked for 11 years as a special agent with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, a position I never discussed in detail with Dominic's social circle, partly out of professional discretion, and partly because I'd learned early in our marriage that Dominic preferred introducing me at his industry events simply as someone who worked in government compliance, a description vague enough to avoid any conversation he might find inconvenient. I remember one specific gala, maybe 4 years into the marriage, standing beside Dominic while he introduced me to a business partner, using that exact phrase, watching the partner's eyes glaze over with polite disinterest before turning immediately back to Dominic's latest acquisition. I didn't correct the description that night the way I hadn't corrected it dozens of times before. I told myself it simply wasn't worth the friction, a rationalization I've had considerable time since to examine more honestly than I did in the moment. I let that vagueness stand for years. I understand now how much of my own professional identity I'd quietly folded away to make our marriage easier to maintain in rooms full of people considerably more interested in Dominic's net worth than in anything I actually did for a living. I filed for divorce 14 months before the day I'm telling you about now. Once it became impossible to ignore a pattern of infidelity and increasingly erratic financial behavior that even my own professional training hadn't fully prepared me to watch unfold inside my own home. I remember the specific evening I finally decided, sitting alone at our kitchen table after Noah had gone to sleep, reviewing bank statements I'd initially pulled simply out of ordinary household budgeting habit, and recognizing patterns in Dominic's spending that my professional training flagged as familiar in ways my personal life very much did not want them to be. Dominic's response to the divorce filing was, I understand now, entirely predictable, though I didn't see it coming clearly enough at the time. He retained Kessler and Barnwell, a law firm with a specific, well-earned reputation for aggressive custody litigation on behalf of wealthy clients, and began, within weeks, constructing a version of our marriage considerably different from the one I'd actually lived through. I remember the first filing I received from his attorneys, a 14-page document describing me in careful legal language as emotionally volatile and professionally evasive, citing specific incidents I recognized instantly as ordinary marital disagreements reframed retroactively into evidence of instability. I sat with that document at my kitchen table for nearly an hour, understanding, for the first time with full clarity exactly how methodically this was going to be fought. The first sign came 4 months into the proceedings. A court ordered psychological evaluation Dominic's attorneys had requested, conducted by a psychiatrist named Dr. Warren Fitch, whose report concluded with considerable specificity that I exhibited significant depressive symptomatology that raised reasonable concerns about my capacity for stable sole custody. I want to tell you plainly that I have never been depressed a day in my adult life. Certainly not during a period I remember with total clarity as one of the most focused and clear headed stretches of my entire career. I requested my own independent evaluation. It took considerable time and expense to schedule, time Dominic's attorneys used in the interim to build an entire courtroom narrative around Dr. Fitch's initial findings. I later learned, through my own attorney's careful research, that Dr. Fitch had testified in at least 3 other high profile custody cases over the preceding 5 years, each time for the wealthier of the two litigants, each time reaching remarkably similar conclusions about the other parent's psychological stability. That detail alone should have been enough to disqualify his testimony entirely. It wasn't. Not in front of the judge presiding over my case, for reasons I wouldn't fully understand until months later. Owings? The second sign came 2 months later, a financial disclosure that Dominic's attorneys filed claiming I had no independently verifiable income, built on a technicality involving how federal agents' compensation gets reported through classified payroll channels for security reasons. A technicality Kessler and Barnwell's team understood perfectly well and exploited anyway, knowing how it would read to a judge unfamiliar with federal employment structures. I spent considerable effort over the following weeks working with my own agency's legal liaison office to produce documentation that would satisfy the court without compromising the specific security protocols governing federal law enforcement compensation. The process took considerably longer than it should have, and I understood, watching each delay compound the narrative Dominic's team was building, exactly how deliberately this particular technicality had been chosen. I remember sitting in my attorney's office, a careful, overworked woman named Delia Marsh who genuinely believed in my case, but had, I could tell, never gone up against a legal team with quite this level of resources before. They're building a narrative, she told me. Depressed, unemployed, unstable. It doesn't need to be true, Sarah. It just needs to be plausible enough for one judge to believe it. I want to tell you about the specific moment that changed everything, because it's the hinge this whole story turns on, and it happened considerably earlier than the courtroom scene I opened with. Roughly 6 months before that final hearing, in the course of an entirely unrelated federal investigation into a regional money laundering network operating through shell real estate holding companies, my division's analysis flagged a series of transactions connected to several LLCs registered under addresses associated with Reyes Development Group. I remember the exact moment that flag crossed my desk. A routine morning reviewing a batch of automated alerts alongside 3 other unrelated cases, my coffee still too hot to drink properly, before I recognized the registered agent's address as one I'd seen, years earlier, on paperwork for one of Dominic's early acquisitions. I sat completely still for a long moment, rereading the flag twice, hoping, honestly, that I'd misread something. I sat with that discovery for several days, understanding immediately the considerable professional complexity of investigating a company connected, even loosely, to my own ongoing divorce. I brought the conflict to my supervisor directly and formally the same day I confirmed the connection, exactly as protocol required. I want to be honest that those few days before disclosure were among the most difficult of the entire 6 months, not because I considered hiding the connection, which was never genuinely an option I weighed, but because I understood, even before disclosing it, exactly how complicated my professional and personal life were about to become simultaneously. Not be. My supervisor, a measured, exacting man named Assistant Director Okafor, listened to the full disclosure and made a decision I've been grateful for every day since. Rather than removing me from any involvement entirely, which would have simply handed the investigation to someone with less institutional knowledge of exactly how these shell structures operated, he assigned a completely separate team to lead the Reyes connected thread specifically, with me formally recused from any direct decision-making, informed only of developments relevant to protecting the integrity of my own ongoing custody case. He explained his reasoning to me directly, sitting across his desk that same afternoon. "You didn't go looking for this, Sarah," he said. "The system flagged it independently, the same way it would have for anyone else's shell company. I'm not going to punish good analytical work by pretending you have to choose between your career and your custody case. I am going to make certain every wall between those two things stays exactly where it needs to be. I want to be precise about this because I think it matters enormously. I did not investigate my own ex husband personally. I did not direct, influence, or participate in a single operational decision regarding that investigation. I simply happened to be the analyst whose original work flagged the pattern, and I was kept informed at arm's length by colleagues bound by the same professional integrity I'd have demanded of myself in their position. The investigation, led by a senior agent named Priya Osei, developed over those 6 months into something considerably larger than the initial shell company flag suggested. Dominic, it turned out, had spent nearly 4 years structuring payments through a network of LLCs specifically designed to obscure over $11 million in unreported income, evading federal taxes on a scale that, once fully documented, moved well beyond a civil matter into serious criminal territory. Priya and I had worked together on two previous cases years earlier, long before either of us had any reason to imagine our careers would intersect this way again. Under these particular circumstances, I trusted her completely, both as an investigator and as someone I knew would maintain exactly the professional boundaries the situation required, neither softening findings out of sympathy for my custody case, nor hardening them out of any misplaced sense that harsher treatment of Dominic somehow made the investigation more legitimate. Priya kept me updated on developments only insofar as they might affect the custody proceedings unfolding in parallel, careful never to share operational specifics that might compromise the broader investigation. I remember her calling me roughly 2 months before the final custody hearing, her voice carrying a specific caution I recognized immediately from years of working alongside her. "Sarah," she said, "I need you to understand something serious. We've identified payments from one of Dominic's shell entities to an account connected to Judge Franklin Pruitt. Your case, Sarah. He's presiding over your actual custody case. Tevigride. I want to describe what that discovery felt like because I think it matters more than the eventual dramatic resolution. I sat in my car outside my own house for nearly 20 minutes after that call, understanding, with a specific cold clarity, that the judge deciding whether I retained custody of my own son had potentially already been paid to decide against me, months before he ever heard a single piece of testimony. Priya told me the investigation into the judicial payments would be to proceed carefully, methodically, corroborated thoroughly enough to withstand the considerable legal scrutiny that comes with prosecuting a sitting judge, and that rushing the timeline to protect my custody case specifically could jeopardize the entire broader case against both Dominic and Pruitt together. I made a decision, sitting in that car, that I'd thought about often in the months since. I told Priya I understood completely and that I wasn't going to ask the investigation to move faster than the evidence actually required, regardless of what that meant for my own custody hearing in the meantime. I want to be honest about how difficult that decision actually was. I was being asked to walk into a courtroom knowing the judge might be compromised, knowing my ex husband's attorneys were building a case against my fitness as a mother using fabricated psychological findings, and to simply continue through that process as though I didn't know what I knew. Because the larger case required patience, I wasn't entirely certain, some nights, that I actually had left in me. There were specific nights during those 4 months, lying awake long after Noah had gone to sleep, when I genuinely questioned whether I'd made the right call. I thought more than once about simply walking into Judge Pruitt's chambers myself and telling him plainly what I knew, understanding, even as I imagined it, exactly how badly that impulsive move could compromise both the custody case and the broader federal investigation simultaneously. I called Priya on 2 of those nights just to hear her confirm again that patience remained the correct path. She never once told me what I wanted to hear simply to comfort me. She told me what was actually true, which I've come to understand was its own particular kind of kind. I want to tell you, too, about Delia Marsh during this period, my own attorney, who had no idea about the federal investigation running in parallel, bound as I was by strict confidentiality about an active case. I watched her work herself to exhaustion, building the strongest defense she could with the tools available to her, genuinely believing for those 4 months that we were headed toward a considerably worse outcome than either of us wanted to imagine. I've since told her the full story once the case became public. She told me she wished I'd been able to tell her sooner, and I told her I wished that too, though I understood, even then, exactly why I couldn't have. The final custody hearing arrived on a gray Thursday morning, 4 months after Priya's call in my car, the federal investigation having reached, in the interim, a point Priya described only as considerably close to actionable. Without giving me further specifics, I wasn't clear to know. I remember dressing that morning with unusual care, a habit I recognized from years of preparing for high stakes professional testimony, understanding that whatever composure I managed to project in that courtroom would matter considerably more to the outcome than I wanted it to. Noah stayed with a trusted neighbor that day, old enough to understand something important was happening, too young for me to explain any of the actual specifics involved. Dominic's attorneys presented their case first, walking Judge Pruitt through Dr. Fitch's psychological evaluation, to the fabricated income disclosure, to a carefully constructed narrative describing me as unstable, financially precarious, and unfit for the sole custody I was requesting. Judge Pruitt's rulings throughout that morning followed a pattern I recognized, with each one as increasingly transparently favorable to Dominic's position, sustaining objections that should have been overruled, permitting testimony that should have been challenged, moving the proceedings steadily toward a conclusion that felt, by early afternoon, essentially predetermined. I sat at that table for nearly 4 hours, maintaining the exact composure I'd trained myself to hold through considerably higher stakes situations than this one, while a psychiatrist paid to reach a predetermined conclusion described me to a judge who'd already been paid to agree with him. I remember specific moments during that morning when I genuinely doubted my own ability to sit still through the remainder of it, and specific moments when I reminded myself deliberately of exactly what was arriving that afternoon, whether or not the room currently understood it yet. Dominic found me during the lunch recess, in the hallway outside the courtroom, his lawyers a few steps behind him, his expression carrying the specific, easy confidence of a man who already believed the afternoon's outcome was settled. I remember the specific way he approached, unhurried, almost genial, the posture of a man who considered the entire proceeding already concluded in his favor and wanted apparently to extend some small, condescending grace to the woman he expected to lose everything within the hour. His attorneys hung back near the courtroom doors, close enough to intervene if needed, far enough to maintain the appearance that this conversation was somehow separate from the legal proceedings still technically underway. "You should have taken the settlement I offered months ago, Sarah," he said. "Would have saved you all this embarrassment." I didn't want a settlement, I told him. I wanted my son raised by someone who tells the truth. He laughed, the specific, dismissive laugh I remembered from years of watching him dismiss anyone whose resources he considered beneath his own attention. "In this country, money and power decide everything, Sarah. You're just a nice round zero." I remember, oddly, thinking of Priya in that exact moment, somewhere across town finalizing paperwork I wasn't clear to know the specifics of, entirely unaware that Dominic had just handed me, unknowingly, the exact opening line I'd been waiting 6 months to use back at him. I want to tell you exactly what I felt standing in that hallway, hearing that sentence. Not anger, though I understand why anger would be the expected reaction. What I actually felt was something closer to a strange, focused calm, the specific sensation of watching a man say something considerably truer than he understood, about a set of facts he had no idea I was about to demonstrate directly back to him. "You might be right about that," I told him. "Money and power do decide quite a lot in this country. I've actually spent the last 6 months learning exactly how much of yours decided this particular outcome." He didn't have a response to that. I don't think he fully registered the sentence as a threat, rather than simply an odd, defiant thing to say on my way back into a courtroom he believed was already lost to me. The afternoon session resumed with closing arguments, Dominic's lead attorney walking Judge Pruitt through a final summary of my supposed instability, my supposed lack of verifiable income, my supposed unsuitability for the custody I was requesting. Judge Pruitt thanked both sides, shuffled his papers with the specific, unhurried confidence of a man about to deliver a ruling he'd already decided weeks earlier, and began the formal language that precedes a custody determination. Having carefully considered the evidence presented, he said, "This court finds," I stood up. I want to be honest that even in that exact moment, some small, cautious part of me hesitated, understanding that once I stood, there was no version of the remaining minute that unfolded quietly. 6 months of careful, disciplined patience had trained me to wait for exactly the right threshold before acting, and some part of me needed a full second to confirm internally that this was actually it, rather than simply the moment my own nerves finally ran out. I want to describe that moment slowly because I've replayed it more times than almost any other moment in my life. I took off my glasses, set them down deliberately on the table in front of me, and reached into my jacket pocket for the credential wallet I've carried in every courtroom appearance of my professional career, though never once until that exact moment in this particular one. I remember the specific weight of that wallet in my hand, considerably heavier than its actual physical weight would suggest, carrying 11 years of a career I'd spent quietly folding away in rooms exactly like this one, for the comfort of a marriage that had, by that point, already ended in every way that actually mattered. Your Honor, I said, before you finish that ruling, I'd like the court to know that I'm a senior special agent with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division and that I have information directly relevant to the integrity of these proceedings. I watched Judge Pruitt's face change first, a specific rapid recalculation I recognized instantly from considerable professional experience watching people process catastrophic new information in real time. Dominic's face changed a half second later, his easy confidence draining away in a way I found, I'll admit honestly, considerably more satisfying than I'd expected to feel. The courtroom doors opened at the exact moment I finished that sentence, Priya Osei walking in first, followed by 4 armed federal agents, moving through the gallery with the specific, controlled urgency of people executing a plan considerably larger than the room currently understood. "Judge Franklin Pruitt," Priya said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent courtroom, "you're under federal arrest for accepting bribes in connection with judicial proceedings in violation of federal anti-corruption statutes." Judge Pruitt's gavel, still raised from the ruling he'd never finished delivering, slipped from his hand entirely, clattering against the bench. "Dominic Reyes," Priya continued, turning toward my ex-husband, "you're under federal arrest for tax evasion, money laundering, and bribery of a public official based on evidence developed over the past 6 months of federal investigation." I watched Dominic's attorneys, the same considerable legal team that had spent months constructing a narrative designed to strip me of custody, stand frozen near their table, understanding, in the same instant everyone else in that room understood, that the strategy they'd been executing so confidently for months had just collapsed entirely, not through any legal maneuver on my part, but through a truth that had been quietly assembling itself in a parallel investigation the entire time. I looked directly at Dominic as agents moved to secure him and said the sentence I'd been carrying, carefully, for considerably longer than that single afternoon. "You said money and power decide everything in this country," I told him. "You were right about one thing, Dominic. I spent 6 months tracing exactly where your money actually came from and exactly who it paid off along the way. It decided quite a lot in the end, just not the outcome you were expecting." He didn't respond. I don't think there was anything left in him capable of forming a response at that particular moment. Watching federal agents secure his wrists in the same courtroom where he'd expected, 90 seconds earlier, to walk out with sole custody of our son. Here is the twist I want to tell you about now. The one that mattered considerably more than the arrest itself, and the one I didn't fully understand until Priya explained it to me privately, several hours later. Judge Franklin Pruitt, it turned out, hadn't been compromised solely by Dominic's payments. The Department of Justice's Public Integrity Section had been quietly investigating Pruitt for nearly 3 years before my case ever crossed his docket, building a case around a documented pattern of bribery across at least 6 other custody and family court proceedings, all involving wealthy litigants willing to pay considerably more than the going rate for a favorable ruling. I sat in Priya's office that evening, still processing the sheer scale of what she was describing, understanding, gradually, that the specific judge who'd nearly ruled against me that afternoon had built an entire secondary income stream out of selling exactly the kind of outcome Dominic had been so confidently expecting to receive. Priya told me, sitting in her office that evening, that Dominic's payments had actually been the final, cleanest piece of evidence the public integrity section needed, connecting a specific, traceable financial pattern to a judge whose broader corruption had been maddeningly difficult to fully corroborate through the other five cases alone. The other five families structured their payments considerably more carefully, Priya told me. Cash transfers, offshore intermediaries, considerably harder to trace cleanly. Dominic, for all his resources, made a specific, foolish assumption that a domestic shell company structure would be sufficient cover. It wasn't. And it happened to be exactly the clean, traceable pattern our forensic accountants needed to finally close the loop on Pruitt's entire operation. Happick. Your case didn't start the investigation into Pruitt, Priya told me. It completed it. There were five other families, Sarah, in five other custody cases over the past several years who lost children to parents willing to pay for exactly the outcome you almost got handed to Dominic this afternoon. I sat with that for a long moment, understanding slowly exactly how much larger this entire story actually was than my own custody case alone. Those rulings are being reopened, Priya told me. All six of them, including yours, obviously, though yours never actually got issued. The other five families have been living with final custody orders for years, believing the outcome was simply the honest conclusion of an honest process. I want to tell you what happened to Noah in the weeks that followed, because I think it matters more than any of the legal proceedings that occupied most of that period. Custody was formally awarded to me within 3 weeks under an emergency federal review process expedited by the judicial corruption findings, a ruling that required, this time, no fabricated psychological evaluations or manufactured income disclosures to reach the only outcome that had ever actually reflected the truth. I picked Noah up from his father's temporary residence on a bright Tuesday afternoon, watching his face shift from careful, guarded uncertainty into something closer to relief once he understood, in the specific way 7-year-olds understand things, that whatever had been unsettled about his life for the past several months had finally, actually resolved. He asked me on the drive home that day why he'd had to stay with his grandmother during the scary part with the police, a question I answered as gently and honestly as I could manage for a child his age, telling him simply that some grown-ups had done something dishonest and that honest people had worked hard to fix it. He seemed satisfied with that answer, the way children often are with explanations adults themselves still find considerably more complicated to fully process. He asked a few minutes later whether we could stop for ice cream, and I understood, hearing that question, exactly how much of his own resilience I still had left to be grateful for. Dominic pleaded guilty 11 months later to reduced federal charges as part of a negotiated agreement that still required considerable prison time and the complete forfeiture of Reyes Development Group's remaining assets. Judge Pruitt received a considerably longer sentence, the public integrity section's broader case against him ultimately encompassing all 6 documented instances of judicial bribery, including 2 that predated my own divorce by several years. Dr. Fitch, the psychiatrist whose fabricated evaluation had nearly cost me custody entirely, lost his license to practice within the year, following a state medical board investigation triggered by the pattern Delia's research had first uncovered and federal prosecutors subsequently corroborated across his other testimony. I felt, hearing that particular outcome, less satisfaction than I expected to, mostly a kind of tired relief that whatever families remained in his future custody evaluations would at least be spared his particular brand of paid-for expertise. Delia Marsh called me the week the story became public, her voice carrying a specific mixture of relief and, I think, some professional embarrassment at having built our entire defense without the information I hadn't been permitted to share with her. I told her honestly that her work had been excellent regardless, built on the actual evidence available to her at the time, and that the eventual outcome owed nothing to any shortcoming on her part. She told me she'd never had a case end quite this way before, and I told her, honestly, that I hoped she never had another one quite like it either. The five other families affected by Pruitt's corrupted rulings had their custody cases formally reopened. A process Priya told me was, understandably, considerably more painful for some of them than my own resolution had been, given how many years some of those families had already spent believing their original outcomes reflected honest judgment rather than a paid for verdict. I met one of those parents eventually, a father named Carl Whitcomb who'd lost primary custody of his daughter 4 years earlier in a ruling Pruitt had issued after receiving payments from Carl's ex wife's considerably wealthier family. We spoke for nearly 2 hours at a small coffee shop, comparing the specific shape of a grief neither of us had fully understood until that point had a traceable, provable cause, rather than simply an outcome we'd each privately blamed on our own inadequacy as parents. Carl told me he'd spent those 4 years rebuilding his entire life around a reduced visitation schedule he genuinely believed reflected some fair, if painful, judicial assessment of his own parenting shortcomings. He'd gone to therapy, he told me, specifically to work through what he understood at the time as his own failures, therapy sessions he now recognized, with a considerable mixture of relief and fresh grief, had been spent processing a verdict that had never actually been honest in the first place. I spent 4 years believing I just wasn't good enough, he told me. I didn't know there was actually a reason beyond that. I told him I understood exactly what he meant, and that I hoped his daughter's case, reopened now with considerably more scrutiny than the original proceeding had ever received, would finally give him back what should never have been taken in the first place. We've stayed in touch since, an unlikely friendship built entirely out of a shared, specific kind of institutional betrayal. Neither of us had expected to ever need to understand this intimately. He called me the day his daughter's case was formally reopened, his voice carrying an emotion he told me he hadn't fully let himself feel in nearly 4 years. I understood exactly what that particular relief sounded like, having felt a considerably compressed version of it myself only months earlier in a very different courtroom. I think about that whole 6 months often and what it actually taught me. Not that justice always arrives, because I understand with total clarity exactly how many families like Carl's spend years inside a system that occasionally, quietly fails them completely without any external investigation ever happening to correct it. What it taught me was something quieter than that. The people willing to investigate patiently, methodically, even when the personal stakes make patience considerably harder to maintain, are usually the reason corruption like Judge Pruitt's ever gets fully documented at all. I think about Assistant Director Okafor's decision. That first afternoon I disclosed the conflict, considerably more than I think about my own composure in that courtroom. He could have simply removed me from any proximity to the case entirely, the safer, more defensible choice from a purely bureaucratic standpoint. He chose instead to build the specific, careful walls that let the investigation proceed honestly, while still keeping me informed enough to protect myself and my son. I don't think this story ends the way it did without that particular decision, made months before anyone in that courtroom understood how much would eventually depend on it. I think, too, about the specific arithmetic Dominic was so confident in, standing in that hallway telling me money and power decide everything. He wasn't entirely wrong. Money and power decided a great deal in that courtroom, right up until the exact moment a considerably larger, more patient kind of power, the kind built on documentation rather than intimidation, decided something else instead. I've thought considerably in the months since about how differently this story might have ended if the shell company flag had crossed a different analyst's desk, someone without my particular professional training, someone who might have simply closed the alert as an administrative oversight rather than recognizing an address they'd seen years earlier on paperwork that had nothing to do, at the time, with any federal investigation at all. I don't take that coincidence lightly. I understand exactly how many other families never get the specific, unlikely combination of circumstances that gave Carl and me back what should never have been taken from either of us. If you've ever been told, by someone confident in their own resources, that you're simply a number too small to matter, I understand that particular dismissal better than most people ever will. I don't have a universal formula for answering it. I only know that patience, documented carefully enough, tends to outlast confidence eventually, even when the 6 months in between feel considerably longer than that phrase makes them sound. Noah is 9 now, considerably taller than the 7-year-old I picked up that Tuesday afternoon, and asks me occasionally some version of the same question children eventually ask about difficult chapters in their family's history. I tell him honestly that some grown-ups tried to be dishonest about our family, and that other people working carefully and patiently made sure the truth mattered more in the end than anyone's money did. He seems satisfied with that answer for now. I suspect the fuller version will wait until he's considerably older. I thank you for listening to my story tonight. If it reminded you of a moment someone with more resources than you tried to convince a room you didn't matter, I'd love to hear about it. I hope your own version of that patience gets rewarded, whatever shape that eventually takes. And if you want more stories like this one, stick around. There's always another one waiting. Take care of each other out there. Good night, everyone.